Think we are good to go. I do invite you all to join me, obviously, on camera. That's one of the really important things to me with my students. And not that you're my students today necessarily, but I do ask that if you're able, if you can join us on camera, that would be really wonderful. It is a part of the A.L.I.V.E components that we'll talk about today when I teach my live online classes. As Tom introduced me, I am a professor of psychology. I'm honored to be able to teach psychology. I'm a former math teacher of K through 12. And so it is absolutely amazing every day now to be able to waltz into a psychology classroom and to be able to talk about just about any topic that I can make related to standards. So I apologize in advance to those of you perhaps that teach science, that maybe teach math, and you think, even though I want to push you to think that this isn't necessarily true, but perhaps you think like, gosh, there's no way that I can teach in the way that this guy is suggesting because we have to meet those special benchmarks or standards for our course. I am very much focused on course learning outcomes in all of my teaching. Students do activities related to individual lesson learning objectives as well. And so you'll see ways in which I try to include that as much as possible. But I hope that I can open everyone's eyes, whether you teach in the humanities, the arts, or the sciences and the maths, to be able to utilize something perhaps that you take away from today's conversation. I am hoping that we do in fact have more of a conversation. I don't have a ton of slides with content to share necessarily with you. I will go over a couple of questions we received earlier as many of you registered and asked some questions. So I do want to touch upon some of those. For a little housekeeping, I will not be necessarily monitoring the chat very well right now, especially with this number of participants. So if you wouldn't mind holding off on questions until the end or interjecting the questions using the mic instead. So being on camera, being present, and using the mic would be probably the best and most interactive approach that I would request for today's purposes. So you heard a little bit about who I am, and I told you a little bit more just now, for instance, that I taught K through 12 math for many years. I was also the STEM program ambassador for Palm Beach schools as we aligned with the University of Florida many years ago to bring STEM education and STEM coaching to the district. So I've spent a lot of time in STEM. I hope that you'll see that and recognize that. And I want to really suggest to some of you perhaps that may be thinking, but I don't teach science, I don't teach technology, engineering, or math, that there are ways in which we can all include some of the STEM principles, in particular engineering, which is the E in my acronym that we're going to use today for A.L.I.V.E. So I hope that we can all figure out ways in which in our curriculum we can engineer or have students engineer, which really honestly, I think of it as just getting to the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy in a way that students are creating. So whether you teach math, whether you teach social studies, it really truly shouldn't matter. We should be at some point likely getting students to create things. And that's what I think of when I think of engineering in particular, from the STEM work that I've done over the years. I've also worked in data science, and I've also consulted in designing, analyzing, and publishing research in nursing, education, and psychology. And this is why I value, love teaching human growth and development in particular, because my students get a flavor of what I've learned from nursing. They get a flavor of what I do as an educator. And obviously with my background in psychology, they also hear that. I also see clients therapeutically as well. So I'm able to include many of those sort of scenarios. So again, it makes it personally for me quite enjoyable and a lot of fun. And I hope to inspire you, regardless of what you teach, to utilize many of these techniques to be able to increase the amount of life organically in your classes. So let's get started with a little bit of play. Who doesn't like to play, right? So I want you to take your phone camera and go ahead and scan this QR code. It will take you to a Wordle. It is a Wordle that I created, and I will warn you, if you do, for instance, a New York Times Wordle yourself, I'm going to tell you that this one maybe violates some of the general principles with the New York Times Wordle. In particular, the biggest hint is that it does end with the letter S. There are times, for those of you I'm sure who have done it before, that the New York Times has had words that end with S, but usually they don't. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you right off the bat that the last letter in your Wordle today does, or is rather, an S. But that's enough of a giveaway. I'll give you a moment to scan the QR code and to get started. And so one of the premises that I'm really working on, hopefully with you here, is to sort of show to you how I'm modeling what I ask my students to do. Not that Wordles are always the most favorite thing that comes to their mind when they think of games or they think of playing. But I find that over the years, it really has sparked students to engage a little bit more. They come early to class so that they can scan the Wordle or the code or whatever it is that I'm doing for that particular day so that they can engage in the conversation. It usually, for purposes of the activity, is related then to the lesson that I'm teaching in some way or another. And then it obviously then naturally creates some association with vocabulary, which is a big part of how I teach. I teach from a very literacy-based perspective, where everything comes back to how we break words down, how we understand what words mean. Because in particular in psychology and in all disciplines, really, from what I've ever seen in instructional design, we have vocabulary that is obviously very content specific, but there are certainly ways in which the words that are used in that content relate to the way in which we use the words in everyday life. So for instance, in the last couple of weeks, I've been teaching about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in my classes. And students come to really simply understand the idea of the notion of in versus ex and words that they may have seen or heard that start with those prefixes as a way, again, of course, of connecting to the literacy component and getting them to go beyond just, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed by hearing the word or phrase intrinsic motivation as it compares to extrinsic motivation. All right, I hope I gave you sufficient time to work on that, even though I was talking at you at the same time. But in the interest of time, I did want to sort of continue on with the activity. And if you happen to get it correct, the word of the day on our Wordle today was Zooms, because we've all been involved in lots of Zoom sessions. And so I just pluralized it, of course, to make it 5 letters for one, and for it to be fitting, obviously, for our activity that we're working on today. This is a word that was created by the University of Miami, hence the colors. I'm a Gator, so of course these colors don't work for me, but this was created by the University of Miami just based on analysis of words that were being used and words that have become a part of our sort of vernacular because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Zoom certainly has become one of those standards of sort of where we are and perhaps where we may continue to be for some time. So how exactly did we get here? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of Palm Beach State from one side, and then my own personal journey as well to sort of where we are today. So of course, we had traditional instruction. We also had online teaching in terms of fully online instruction prior to the pandemic. But traditionally, it was sort of you went to a brick and mortar building, as most of us probably did. We then, of course, as we all recall in 2020, had this emergency remote instructional methodology or paradigm because of the pandemic. As a result of that, Palm Beach State decided pretty early on that we would have these courses that we call now live online. Live online, for our purposes, is considered to be a synchronous class that basically is taught via Zoom. It's taught via some sort of video conferencing technology, but we teach it at Palm Beach State using Zoom. So it is remote, but these terms are confusing to many people, and even to our students still to this day. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion as to what do we mean by live online? And so I've designed this presentation to talk about the acronym A.L.I.V.E, because really and truly in all of our instruction, we're probably wanting to bring the material to life. We want to bring life to the classroom. We want to use that term to make sure that we're reflecting the reality of learning in a way that's applicable to our students and their own lives as well. So there are many ways in which that acronym may be of value or useful to us. My own personal journey is very similar, that I taught traditional for many years, K through 12 primarily, but then also taught as an adjunct instructor at Palm Beach State, brick and mortar. Then I started teaching fully online, which means that I didn't have any experience really with live online, but I felt, gosh, this should be easy. This will be perfect. I taught online already, so what's the difference? It's just that I'm going to be live online. And we certainly know that there are lots of differences in terms of what a class looks like fully online as opposed to what a class might look like as live online. My students all know, like I asked you all to join me, for instance, on camera today and encourage you to pick up the microphone, but that is a primary driver of my instructional model, is that we need presence. We need to be present and aware at the same time. And so that is something that I know that not necessarily every college may be able to ask, but I do ask that all of my students are on camera. And I've seen that it makes a tremendous amount of difference. So when we first went remote and we started these live online classes, I felt most days, like many of you perhaps do, like I was talking to myself. And literally over the past 3 semesters where I've required students by putting it simply on the syllabus, our college also allows students to be loaned computers that they can use to participate in live online classes. So we remove that sort of a barrier, because certainly I completely understand that for equity purposes, we would not want to require it as part of a grade, for instance, that a student is on camera. But the idea is that I want them to be really present and to be engaged. But we all know, of course, you can be on camera. Many of you perhaps are on camera right now, and you could be doing other things. And so there are other components to the instruction that needs to be in place in order to engage our students. So simply their presence may not be sufficient. Again, if there's a question, I think I heard a microphone. Don't be afraid to jump in. All right, so in today's webinar, I want to talk to you about 2 primary things. The first is what I consider to be my pedagogical framework, which I've mentioned a couple of times already, the acronym A.L.I.V.E. It was in our advertising as well, and we'll go over this in more detail momentarily, but it stands for attend, listen, inquire, vibe, and as I mentioned before, one of the key parts to me is engineer. I'll share with you my template that I use for live online, or we can call it remote instruction, and then go over a couple of instructional technologies that I'm so sure that the majority of you are very familiar with, but I also want to give you some examples of ways in which I've used them that perhaps may not be the most creative, but I found that they certainly have been very helpful in engaging students in terms of that component of, yes, you're there, you're on camera, that's awesome, but are you engaging in and participating in the learning process itself? So we'll go over a couple of those as well. And I do want to pause for a quick moment before I jump in here to suggest that there are obviously very many different roads that can lead to the same destination. So some people may use the sort of quote of, there are many ways to skin a cat, for instance. And we need to recognize that, because I received a question, for instance, what are ways to have faculty see the value in using these technologies when they're stuck in their own ways? And so that was a very poignant question to me, that perhaps the traditional method still works. It does. Don't tell anybody. You're here now, of course, because you want to learn more about teaching live online in an approach similar to what I'm doing, but the traditional method certainly works. So if an instructor is really stuck in the way that they want to continue to teach in a traditional way, I don't think there's anything necessarily inherently wrong, but I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on that. So I'll pause for a moment to see if anybody has any major objections to my assertion, or anything that we can kind of contribute to the conversation related to the question of getting others to not be stuck in their ways as it relates to the use of instructional technology, perhaps in a live online setting. Don't be shy. One of the things my students come to learn really early on, having training in psychology, I also am not afraid of wait time.
Sure. Dax, just a real quick question, and I apologize. Yeah, just kind of a clarifying question, and that is, I have some faculty who have done the synchronous online, and we have students that the modalities are they're on campus, and so we've actually had students come to campus, go to a class, and then have to find a study room to have an online synchronous thing, and it's actually problematic. Just for resources. Is your demographics at your university just where people are just not coming to campus anymore? And that's the only reason we've really had trouble with this, is just a student getting frustrated. Like, wait a second, I came to campus and now I got to find a little place to go and do it. And that's my only question. Thanks so much.
No, of course, I appreciate that. So we're probably pretty fortunate in that regard, I would say. I can't speak for all of our 5 campuses collectively, but in my experience with my classes, the majority of my students are at home or in their own space, essentially. So they're just joining from another location and being able to tap in. So I can completely understand potential frustration from both sides, from the side of the student, having to create that space, and from the side of the faculty in the college, who may need to sort of work in being creative in developing spaces. I will say, for instance, that we do have spaces at Palm Beach State, of course, where students can use for these sorts of situations. In a library, there are private rooms, or there are rooms that are large enough for smaller groups of students to join together. And that's one of the things that I've always encouraged students to do if they feel like, they can't do it at home alone, or they don't have the technology necessarily to do that, is to definitely, utilize the campus resources as much as possible. But yeah, I wish I had a solution to sort of say, gosh, like we could just create these metaverses for each individual student to go into, and they would all just sort of receive the content in a live online fashion. And certainly it's here, and I'm sure there are some colleges that are utilizing that sort of approach, but it's not something that's necessarily accessible for all. Melissa, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I teach sociology, and I also am helping my college figure out how to do quality matters stuff. And so there's a little bit of pushback, right, as there often is. But when you talked about, the folks that don't want to change, my big thing is, well, is what you're doing working? Because if what you're doing working, then don't change it. You're great. Everything is fine. But if you're the faculty member that in a meeting, every time they're just constantly complaining about how students nowadays, right? And that, they can't get them to email, they can't get them to show up, et cetera. It's like, well, then it might just be you, right? It might be a little bit about how your stuff is a little bit outdated, and let's come and, find something fun to do. And, so that's kind of where I am with that. It's like, if it works, fine, right? If it's not broken, don't fix it. That's my take on it.
I love that. So I kind of lied to you guys in a sense, because I don't necessarily believe the statement that I made before. I think we do need to adapt, and we need to change, and we need to grow, and we need to obviously, be at the same space, time, presence with our students in terms of what we deliver to them, when we deliver it, and how we deliver it. I will say I'm incredibly fortunate that at Palm Beach State, we continuously sort of assess what students' needs are. And we've been told by administration in many ways that, we are here to serve the students. And so if students want more live online classes, guess what we're going to have? Whether faculty like it or not, we're going to have more live online classes. But I think you're absolutely right. The pushback oftentimes then is the traditional method can still work. And I've done a lot of research on this. I published, in fact, on this with the College of Nursing at FAU. Traditional methods of instruction in nursing still work. But if we can include things that make learning more fun, for instance, with simulators and simulation technology, then potentially we have a bigger impact. Because we all know that if students like you as the faculty member, if students like the content that they're learning about, and they get to perhaps choose what they learn about, then they likely are more engaged. And we imagine that greater engagement will lead to greater learning, or longer lasting learning, at least. They may not necessarily prove that on an exam or a particular quiz, but they likely will showcase this learning for longer periods of time. And so that's actually really my push and my approach, is that when I use the word engineering, I know people panic and freak out, but that's my point, is that everything in my class is directed toward some sort of course learning objective in a way that it's students developing their knowledge and utilizing that knowledge in an application. So one of my favorite assignments, and my students actually really enjoy it as well, is in my human growth and development class. We start out the semester building a toy. And of course, immediately students are like, oh, toy, we get to build a toy? Like, oh, we get to bring our toys in? Okay, great. So they can bring their toys, they can showcase their toys, they can show why this toy was good or bad. But then they don't realize, but I'm subtly including these milestones, these developmental milestones, that now they're having to think, is that toy appropriate for a 4-year-old? And now they're really having to think about the content, but it's in a way that makes it much more enjoyable and much more fun to them, as opposed to, here is a table of the developmental milestones. This is when a child can do this particular thing, and me basically telling them everything as opposed to them engaging with it. And I find that they value it a whole lot more, and they learn a whole lot more without me even really telling them that they're learning. They're realizing that they're actually learning a whole lot. So I know there were a couple of other hands, but I'm going to move on just for now, since we can jump in a little bit into the webinar itself. So the pedagogical framework is related to this abbreviation A.L.I.V.E. So what do I mean by that? We talked, of course, about, and now my technology is stuck. There we go. All right. The A stands for attend. If students don't attend, we all know, then learning is lessened. I can't say learning evaporates or goes away completely, but certainly attendance has been, and was more so early on in the pandemic, a major issue that I faced, and perhaps many of you did as well. But once we get to that space of attendance, or through that space of attendance, we start to see that the other parts of the acronym can come into play. So of course we can incentivize attendance. We can also recently, I implemented an assignment at the very beginning of the semester where students are asked to attempt to quantify what missing a single class might mean long-term. I never thought of it before. And I've seen incredible responses since then. And many students have recognized the patterns that I've recognized, that early on missing class obviously usually ends up in you being reported as not attending and being withdrawn. But let's say you make it past that, but you continue to miss class, likely the chances of withdrawal ultimately are higher. And so immediately we recognize then that the loss is potentially in the entire amount of money paid for that single course. And so they start to recognize early on the value and the importance of attendance. I also, perhaps this is a sticky point for many people, is that I don't post a lot of my sort of class assignments online. With grace, of course, if a student were to email me and say, hey, professor, like I missed this, or I wasn't able to attend because of this reason or whatever, and they have sort of numbers of times that they can do that without having to provide real documentation. But I don't just put everything online, because the first couple of semesters after the pandemic was sort of, pushing us to live online, I did that. And then I had students who never came to class. They basically did all the work fully online. Well, that wasn't the modality that they signed up for. So for this webinar, we are talking about, again, about a synchronous class where attendance is really essential. We all likely have attendance listed on our syllabi, and there may be your college policy or your own individual faculty policy of 80 or 90% attendance requirement. So I think attendance is sort of an obvious. The second is listen. We've got to listen. So, and I'll show you some techniques that I'm going to use here or explain to you in just a moment in terms of how we sort of approach this and how we get this to work. So if you're not listening right now, you're not hearing what I have to say and you're just checked out. And that's perfectly fine for your purposes. But when it comes then time, let's say we had an exam at the end of this, then you would be sort of having to go back and spend more time. So again, one of my emphases is really on time. I want to ensure that the time that you spend with me, even though right now we're sort of more in conversation, the time that I spend with my students is about engagement, about being involved in an activity, using the information that you've learned through reading, through videos, and so forth, to be able to enact what you can impart upon an assignment itself. Most important to me is this inquiry piece. So students are pushed in my live online and in all my classes, honestly, to inquire. And I take the time sometimes to check to see if they are listening by pausing to require them to post an inquiry, for instance, in the chat. So right now, I want you to write a question in the chat that's based on what we just discussed. It could be a question that could potentially be like on an exam. And all of a sudden they hear that word and they're like, oh boy, okay, we're going to pay attention to what's in the chat. We're going to copy down all of the questions other people type in the chat, because they come to learn that I actually will do that. I will pull questions that students create. And of course, most of the time I have to change them a little bit, but I can adapt those in a way that it requires them to really be in attendance, because you're not going to get the Zoom chat log. You had to listen because you had to realize, wow, right now we're talking about questions, and then you've got to be able to ask good questions. And we talk about what good questions are as well. This one's the most fun one to me, and the one that my students really enjoy. And they're always like, Mr. But you're this old person. They love that, like, oh, we're so old. It's like, yeah, you'll get there one day too. But this notion is something that you hear our kids nowadays, Gen Z in particular, talk a lot about vibe. If they're not vibing with you, then it's done, right? They might as well not be in attendance, because they're not listening, and they're definitely not interested and curious in inquiring about what you're teaching them. So I use this as sort of an opportunity that, I don't necessarily get to their level of understanding and using all the vernacular that they may use, but we create enough opportunity that they seem to appreciate that we're vibing, that we're in this together, that we're understanding each other, and that I let them run with things a lot. And again, that's probably the luxury I have because I teach psychology, that I can give them that sort of luxury. If we're teaching math and we're trying to solve a quadratic equation, I'm not sure how much liberty you can really give a kid to just sort of vibe with you to make up a story or tell a song or sing a song related to the quadratic formula. And then, of course, at the end of the day, all of this for me relates to this notion of being able to engineer. There's no particular order. So at first I started thinking, gosh, yes, attendance comes first, listening comes second, and it can go in that order, but it doesn't have to. And so really for me, though, the biggest premise is that within every one of these, we're working on the component of engineering. So I use a lot of tools. So I was thinking about this and I thought, gosh, what do I do to help increase attendance, to help increase listening, and to help increase inquiry. And one of the tools that I use very regularly, and I used to use this even in brick and mortar, is this random name picker. And there are many of them available out on the web. This one in particular I use comes from classtools.net. I call it the wheel of names, or my students come to dread it in some ways as what I call on the spot. So they are put on the spot. Their names every class period go in the wheel. Perhaps I may remove them if they answered a question and so on and so forth. And I can use this obviously for attendance, right? Because if it pops up and you're not responding, even if you're there and you're not responding, then technically to me, according to my syllabus, you have not been in attendance. So I can do this as an attendance checker. It certainly is a checking of listening. So Sandy Shaw, are you with us today? Like, are you responding? And these are all made up names, of course, from the picker that I just took the screenshot of. And then again, like I mentioned before, I use the inquiry a lot. So I may then say, Sandy Shaw, it's your turn to come up with a question or to pose a question to the class. And so I use something as simple as this to be able to basically tap into all three of those parts of the acronym.
And then what do you do if they say, do they say pass? Like, how do they?
And they can. So we play. So in order to vibe with them a little bit, to be honest, Melissa, I will give them sort of outs or, say, oh, you can pass the potato or, like whatever, just to kind of create some opportunity. Like maybe they weren't listening, but their name clearly will not be removed this time around from the wheel. And so they're back in the mix, so to speak. So they have to then make sure that they're listening. And I'm still very old school in the way that I still take notes. I have a little notepad next to me and I make a little note, on my real attendance list to say like, hey, Sandy Shaw didn't respond or gave a pass on this particular one. And they get points for these things. Sometimes it's extra credit points, but other times it's actual points. So if I decide, for instance, that this week in class, I'm pretty sure I can hit on all 35 students, for instance, this week with the name picker, then I just let the name picker run and everybody gets an opportunity using the name picker. And it's not every week because from the psychology perspective, if I did this every week, A, it would take a bunch of time, and B, they would get just way too attuned to it. And it would just be sort of like, not a novel experience for them. So I use this, but it's not something I'm not suggesting that we would use every single day or every single week. But it's something that really can be a lot of fun. And if you use the actual wheel, and you don't have to, you certainly can use an Excel document and use a random number generator of any sort to have it prepared ahead of time. I personally like the spinning of the wheel and the sound. And so playing that over Zoom and them hearing this and sort of like wondering like, oh no, it's close to my name, again, keeps them sort of engaged and motivated a little bit more. I also use a lot of graphic organizers. The graphic organizers for me hit primarily on the listening and the inquire. And one of my favorite websites is from hm8co.com. I'll drop the link in the chat if I can figure it out here in a little while. But I really like that website that it gives actual worksheets that are graphic organizers that students, I encourage them to use, and sometimes I force them to use it. For instance, they just finished writing a paper on the connection between hope and consciousness, and I required them to use the graphic organizer that we did in class, which was a simple KWL. I was completely shocked and surprised this semester that here we are, gosh, 10, 11 weeks into the semester, and many of my students said they'd never even heard of a KWL. So once I showed it to them, some were like, oh yeah, okay, I've seen that, I know what that is, but still many of them had no clue and had never had the experience. And that's the other thing that I think is really key to remember, that I'm witnessing, and many of you probably are experiencing as well. Many of my students currently are A, dual enrolled, or B, they are graduated from high school, but they were in high school during the pandemic for 2 or 3 years, and they may not have had the best instruction. They may not have been exposed to many of the things that we sort of expect that they were. And so I make, at this point, 0 assumptions and really go to essentially showcase to students the ways that they can develop studenting skills, is what I call them. So I teach them how to take notes. I talk to them about how to write good questions. I teach them about how to listen, how to highlight, how to annotate. Because every semester I hear it, annotate, what do you mean by annotate? What do you want me to do? And so we definitely need to continue to encourage these things. And I hope that I'll show you in just a little bit some of the examples of ways in which we can do this online in a way that definitely we can use things that we normally would do in traditional school. Like I used to do carousels a lot in brick and mortar, but you can do a carousel online with a Google Doc, which I'll show you in just a little while. And then, of course, the very simple timer. I use this one a lot in my classes, just setting the timer and giving them time to be able to reflect and to respond. Obviously, it's sort of more about me having wait time because I'm eager, I'm ready, I'm like, let's go, let's move. And it's like, no, you got to let them reflect because they haven't had a chance to process and then digest a lot of the information completely. So again, the A.L.I.V.E components, at least the first three, are pretty easy to hit with these tools. And certainly there are plenty of other tools that we can touch upon as well. Most of you are probably familiar with growth mindset. I want to encourage that we start to think about this concept in terms of what I call achievement mindset. So achievement mindset is geared towards students ultimately engineering and building, because we know from psychological research that if a student successfully builds something, whatever that might mean, and this is different, of course, depending on the content area that you're talking about, but regardless, they build something, they feel something about what they built. As opposed to you telling them what all those milestones are and they memorize them, they don't have that achievement in terms of a product that they can physically or virtually see, feel, touch, or be proud of, in other words. So we know that we all have knowledge, but being proud of your knowledge, you can't really put it on a shelf, right? But if you create a toy that you can be proud of, or you can have it, and I tell them, create a portfolio, especially nowadays, everything's digitized. So create a portfolio of all of your work that you may surprise yourself later down the road that somebody may say to you, gosh, have you ever done X, Y, or Z? And you have now something that you can showcase to students. So the engineering process to me requires that there's some of the vibe component, but more importantly, that there's this mindset. And the mindset that I'm talking about when I call it, or why I call it achievement mindset, is I think of this from something I teach my psych students. So we say that perception is equal to sensation plus attention plus motivation. And then I say plus consciousness when I'm teaching psychology. But for our purposes and sort of making this more general, I think of achievement as obviously we need content. That's the sensation, the information. We're all experts at our content, or we assume that we are in some way or another, or hopefully we are, right? So the content is sort of a given. But these other pieces is where I say we have to get down to the level of the student and be engaged with them. A student's attention is not the student's responsibility alone. It is also the onus on the faculty member, in my perspective, to also help students attend to information. It also is our prerogative to motivate our students. So I do want to pause and ask you in just a moment to reflect in the chat on that. But the last piece is engagement. And so much of this will sort of integrate into ways in which we motivate our students, we share the content with students, we help them attend to what's important, and we engage them in a way that creates sufficient vibe within the classroom. My classroom is based on community, and so we build a lot of community both in our online discussion boards, but then also within our breakout rooms. And so even Zoom itself is amazing. We're not going to do it today, but of course, Zoom breakout rooms are pretty powerful. I hope that you all also have access to the broadcast feature in Zoom. I think we've all had the broadcast feature in text, but from my experience, students never see that. But we also now have broadcast feature by voice, which is really amazing, that you in the main room can make an announcement and it goes to everyone in all the rooms. Like, we've got 5 minutes left, guys, or don't forget to focus on X, Y, or Z, or pick that person now who's going to do the share out. Right. And that can be something that's really easy to use, as opposed to, and one of the questions I got, for instance, was if you've got a class of over 200, it's not likely when you do breakout rooms that you're able to go to every breakout room, because a breakout room probably shouldn't be 50 people. Right. We might think, gosh, we only want 4 breakout rooms because I can jump into all 4 of them. But I promise you, 46 students in each of those rooms is not working or doing anything. Right. There's probably 4 students at most that might be working. So achievement mindset, similar to growth mindset to me, is this notion that we as the faculty need to liaise with the student in helping them understand content, focusing on attention, how we motivate them, and then we build activities that are engaging. So like I mentioned, I do want to pause for a moment. I want to hear your thoughts in the chat, or feel free to pick up the mic as well. In your own content area, how do you get a student to value the information that you are sharing with them? Because to me, that is the motivation. So we've got the content. We think our content is the most important content, or the most interesting or fun or whatever, or all of the above. But a student may not, even though they're taking your course. They may be taking your course just to be able to get that check mark, right, on their transcript, to be able to pass your course to move on. So how do you Increase motivation by helping students realize the value of the information in your own discipline specifically. Good. So I'm seeing lots of things in the chat about tying it to goals, making it relevant, actionable. Absolutely. So those are all pieces that I argue relate to engineering. I also like in sociology, I get students to value concepts because I help them make connections in their lives, in the past, the present, and the future. That is probably the most difficult, but most important, and possibly the easiest in some ways to do. But it's getting them, it's easy because kids can think about it, but it's not always easy to then make those solid connections. But it's important to me that we all help them see how past, present, and future are relevant to whatever it is that they may be learning. So seeing lots of good stuff. And again, point of this is to help, like stories, motivate them by using real life examples. Now, the tricky thing about those real life examples, right, is we used to think back in the day, like our textbooks had real life story problems, and they really weren't real life. So one of the things that I've been challenging myself to do, and I really hope that you all will do the same, is to use actual live data. And so one of my favorite resources to use is Tableau Public. Tableau Public creates dashboards for students, but they have to be consumers of that data. And there's data in Tableau Public for a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be for a math or statistics class. It could be on a psychological concept. It could be on a sociological concept. It could be on a political science concept, and so on and so forth. But I think it's really powerful to be able to give them real data to be able to work with and to be able to appreciate it and to understand. Awesome. So again, I want us to start to think about, and maybe one day, one of you or a couple of you will join me and perhaps write a book on achievement mindset. We know that Carol Dweck's done great with her growth mindset and certainly made some money on that notion, but it would be amazing to build this idea. I obviously, for my math folks out there, do not want to suggest that this is a literal equation, please. Okay, I don't want to hear from you all saying, but there's something missing, you don't have error, or there's other components that maybe it's multiplied and there are other divisions involved. The suggestion is just the way in which we can connect these pieces of obviously content, then attention, adding some motivation, and then engagement. So here is the nuts and bolts of what I do for my classes. Most of my classes meet twice a week. I personally consider one class period each week to be my lecture component, and the other component to be the lab. I am really fortunate, even in my live class on our Boca campus, to have an actual computer lab. So it's almost as if I'm still teaching live online in a way, but it's obviously synchronous in person. So they're very similar in this regard. And so let's say on Tuesday, we have some lecture component. There's obviously always some sort of learning that's involved in terms of material they may have read before, but I also purposefully in the lab include reading that they do with me. And so I forgot to mention earlier, but this is important to note that as we said in the announcement for this, that this is based on a 75-minute class period, essentially, or the numbers really add up to 80, because my classes technically are 80, but I'm using some of that time to also have student meetings. These are not formal student meetings. They're sort of just check-ins. They may be just sort of, oh, I didn't understand that, or I forgot to do that. But again, I always tell them office hours if it's, something specific about grades and so forth. But it opens the door for that conversation as opposed to just saying, just go to office hours or just go online and so on and so on. So you'll see that what I have on the right-hand side is probably the more important part. Like, you all can obviously take this and do whatever it is that you would want with it. My suggestion is that we need to ensure that we obviously utilize our various learning strategies, or learning styles rather. So basically, I think of it from the VARC model: visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic. And so what I generally do is I go down and I sort of ensure that within a given week that I hit at least one visual, one auditory, one read, write, and one kinesthetic in whatever it is that's on the left-hand side that I've decided to do for that particular week. So that's kind of a quick, easy thing to do, but it always just is a reminder to me that I do try, yes, to do more than one for each one, but I make sure that I have at least one of each for the entire week, to the point where usually I end up having one for each class period and many for the same class period, but at least I ensure that throughout the week, a visual learner had some opportunities to really learn from me in a visual way, auditory in the same way, and so on and so forth. What matters more to me is this last column, even though it's only one singular column. It's the 6E. And that's the 6E learning model that I'm going to talk about here in just a little bit. So of course, you can design or decide on the time that you have, what the timings are, and what the actual activities are. I use these activities because I found that they're very useful. So for instance, I like to start my class with a Q&A, where students are asked questions or sometimes asked to come up with questions about theories and terms, because again, I like to teach from a literary perspective. They're always engaging with that vocabulary. And do they go off topic? They absolutely do. But there I am usually in some way trying to get that conversation back to, okay, I heard you use that word. And they were like, did I really? I'm like, yes, you did. You actually use those words even without realizing that you are. And to me, it's just always beautiful to sort of start with content that they are familiar with. I like doing vocabulary galleries, which are quite similar in that way, or some sort of a writing prompt. And so I'm a strong believer in writing across the curriculum. I clearly teach for Gordon Rule requirement for my intro psych class, but in all my classes, I encourage writing no matter what it is. So we reflect a lot in the class. So we get definitely the reading and we get the writing. The visual and the auditory, of course, especially for online purposes, becomes even more crucial, because when we're with students and we can engage them in a more kinesthetic way, that's wonderful. But if we're not able, or we don't think we're able to get the kinesthetic component across as clearly, we need to ensure that our visual and our auditory components are really strong. And when I say visual and auditory, I do not mean lecture, because we all know at this point in time, students, the data shows, switch their needs every 8 seconds. Now, I tell my students upfront about this, and that I'm certainly not going to change what I'm doing every 8 seconds, right? Because that would be total chaos. But I may simply change the inflection of my voice in a way that something has changed. So there needs to be novelty essentially for them every 8 seconds. And a lecture, I can promise you, we all get excited perhaps about this content. You have to hear it. I need to deliver it, but they are probably very much tuned out. So even within a lecture, I like to record lectures and play them in class. So I'm there again as a second opportunity to pause, to reflect, and sort of be with them as they're hearing it. And to also hear myself and think, I wonder if I said that right, or if I could phrase it a different way, or maybe I can ask them, can you think of a better way that I could have said that? So we get these opportunities that we don't have if we just single deliver as sort of delivery in class. So again, the left-hand side I don't think matters incredibly much, because we all will do different things within our courses based on what we need to present and what we want our students to learn. I think we all get the notion of the importance of visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic, but I do want to spend a little bit of time on the 6E model. Before I go there, you may be wondering, it sounds like this guy flips his classroom. And I do to some extent. I call my classroom sort of a hybrid flip in a way. And I love this quote that says, once I started teaching in a flipped classroom, I realized that I had spent most of my career telling students about biology rather than teaching them how to be biologists. Active learning puts the emphasis on students solving relevant problems rather than me telling students what I know. This is my feeling, my sentiment, exactly, not in biology, but in psychology or even in teaching math, is that if I can teach my students how to fish, then obviously I've given them something greater than just knowing what fish is, right? And so I think it's very important that in some regard, regardless of whether you fully flip your classroom or not, that there is an expectation of some sort of a flip. But when I first started doing this and I was like, yeah, I'm going to flip my classroom, kids have to read and they're going to come to class knowing everything and I'm just going to do activities, we know it didn't work, which is why if I go back very briefly, you'll see that within the lab component, I still include reading. It could be reading the textbook in some cases. It may be rereading for some, and I don't care. I still want you to be connected with the content in some way. So the 6E, I don't have time to go into every detail of it, but I love that this picture was already almost made for me, that I really only focus on the engineer, because it almost organically happens if you start to do applications, conceptualizations, that the other parts fall into place with practice. I'm not saying that it's automatic regardless, but we need to engage students. So I start many lessons, for instance, with a video that I know they may be, a movie, for instance, that they may be familiar with. So right now we're working on a project on robots and whether we can design robots to have emotions and to develop consciousness. We know that we're in a space, as Tom mentioned, of talking about artificial intelligence. And so I want my students to be thinking about those kinds of things. And so recently, when we started that module, we looked at a 10-minute clip from iRobot. And students immediately, many of them are so young that they weren't even around when it was originally filmed, but they've seen it at some point. And they all were able to connect and engage with it in a way that they started recognizing the connections that I ultimately wanted them to make. So they've had an experience, they perhaps start to stimulate and ask questions about specific things. So the 6E model that I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with, sort of more of a STEM lesson plan, goes into exploration. Explaining is sort of what we think of traditionally as lecture, but it can be other parts and components as well. Again, with a flip design, you have the opportunity to ask students to explain instead. And so I do a fair amount of that in my class. But really, again, it's to me the engineering, the applying, conceptualizing, informed design, modeling, and creating, whatever that might mean, whether they're creating a product, creating a math equation, it really doesn't matter, but I can promise you in any discipline that you teach or that you support, likely students are able to create something. There's always enrichment that can go beyond the engineering component and then evaluating. And so the model is sort of like a loop, which is great, that you could literally, and I've done this in many classes, that you can basically build one lesson into the next lesson by creating an evaluation of what was done and then thinking about what the next steps may be. And so definitely encourage you to think a little bit more about what that might look like for you or your faculty that you work with. I'm going to jump out of this because I think we're running actually surprisingly fast on time to look at some of the examples that I've created. Again, I'm sure you're familiar with the technologies themselves, Google Docs, Sheets, and Slides. Nearpod is one of my go-tos. I had the question, of course, of having classes of 200. I don't have that, fortunately, but I would say that Nearpod would work amazingly well in those scenarios as well, because students are essentially forced when you do presentation style from the teacher's side, that they're on the same slide that you're on. You can certainly do student-led and they can go at their own pace, but I use Nearpod in a way that students are on the same slide that I'm on, we're on the same page essentially together, and I embed a lot of activities within that sometimes may be super simple. And we have the luxury, and I hope you may have too, with connection into our LMS. So it directly drops stuff into Canvas for us. And so we're able to make things a lot easier. That, I think, honestly, to the question earlier of buy-in and faculty who don't want to change their ways is usually the sticking point. Personally, for instance, when I first wrote this summary, I was planning on talking a little bit more about Packback. Packback is a paid service, so I'm not encouraging anybody to go out and buy it, but they really... I really appreciated and enjoyed the approach that they take because it resonates with the style from which I generally will teach. However, they, at last I've known, have not been able to integrate this very well into Canvas. And so it was another place I had to go to sign in and tell students to sign in and the whole nine. And it just really creates a lot more complexity that I don't think is necessary. Whereas with Nearpod, it's very easy to integrate with Flip, or formerly Flipgrid. I've used that quite considerably as well. And I'm much more excited these days about Parcells because that is a free integrated component for us, at least at Palm Beach State, that we use that is very powerful for annotation. So I'm going to hop out of this for a moment and try to quickly go into a different screen. While I'm doing that, are there any other questions or comments? I know there's been a lot of activity in the chat, which is awesome, but I haven't been following every detail of it. So please, of course, if there's something, please chime in.
Yes, Dex, thank you very much for sharing. And earlier in the chat, a few colleagues, they discussed regarding the universal design for learning. And based on your strategies, do you have any final comments regarding how to enhance accessibility of your A.L.I.V.E classes?
Yeah, so I would say that's definitely something that we're always focused on. It's certainly a struggle that we all face in terms of even something as simple as accessibility based on color. So when I was looking back at this activity that I created for the carousel, I thought, gosh, did I really think through the coloring, for instance, on this? Certainly the image of the carousel is not necessarily something that I need a student to know or to see. I could delete this, but it's always something that's definitely on our minds. I think that the biggest component, honestly, is being able to do, like we have here in Zoom with the closed captioning so that students have that accessibility component to them. And just continuing to think through, like when you create documents, whether you have, the alt text and those components that fortunately have gotten a lot better in most of our Microsoft products. And hopefully with our movement into artificial intelligence, we'll sort of build on that component and capacity a little bit more. But I think that's a wonderful question that I think we also received earlier, Tom, that needs to be a continued dialogue that we all need to be engaged with. We recognize, of course, as I've talked about today, the different learning styles. So we certainly need to continue to recognize the importance and the value of that. But we also need to think about, accessibility in many other ways as well. Just really quickly, I did want to show the carousel activity that I do, for instance, and it has directions that I'm not asking or expecting that you read at this point, but basically students go into a Zoom breakout room that I randomly assign, or if you wanted to do a group that you assign them to, then they can do that as well. The carousel moves by the student going to the next prompt in the document that we all have access to. So of course, we warned them up front, we're all in the same document, and if you edit something, change something, then we all lose it. So you've got to make sure that that's sort of something that we do it first thing in the semester so that everybody gets sort of comfortable with the idea. And this one I did very recently, and I took the answers off, of course, but here are the prompts. And the prompts are obviously, in particular for my subject area, things that students just actually enjoyed. For instance, the prompt number 2. So prompt number 1, they're not so excited. They're like, yeah, well, you're telling us that we're aging because aging starts in our 20s, according to new research. So they didn't like that one. But number 2, they got really excited about. Have you used online dating sites or dating apps? In your view, what are the strengths and limitations of internet dating as a way to find a compatible romantic partner? So they read the prompt. As a group, they reflect on the prompt, then they write a response about the prompt. And like a traditional carousel that you might do in a classroom in brick and mortar, you then go to the next prompt. Normally students would move, but I have to remind them, you're not going to move your Zoom room. You're staying in the same Zoom room. The thing that's moving is the document you're scrolling down. And now with the broadcast, it's a wonderful because I just make the announcement. Now it's time to move on to the next prompt. And it said it in the instructions, but when you get to the end of the last prompt, then number 3 goes to number 1. And then they also have to respond in a different color to the group that already responded when there is a response on there. And so it's a really kind of clever way to get students engaged in hopefully prompts that obviously have meaning and value to the content that you teach, but also has purpose to them and understanding. And I learn so much in this process. So for instance, I learned this past couple of weeks about, apps that now exist where girls or women have sort of the go factor. They're empowered to make that first move. In other words, and they talked about, for instance, the fact that a woman actually designed many of those apps, which is amazing, right? So that we start to see the connections to gender and empowerment, just pieces of diversity that we don't necessarily see. If I just said like dating apps exist, there are strengths and there are limitations, and we could list them out, but to have them go through and to think about them is actually really powerful. As another example, in Google Slides, what I do is this one relates to learning objectives or learning outcomes. So I have the students assigned to breakout rooms again, and they basically are assigned a learning objective that they've read the chapter before, presumably, but I know that's not always the case. So they have time then in their group to sort of read just one section based on one learning outcome or learning objective. They summarize the slide, but I teach from the perspective of always liking examples, images, analogies, and metaphors in particular. So I push them. This is in chapter 7, as you can see. So they've seen me teach this way for many chapters, but now it's their time to sort of showcase what they can pull from the internet. And the things that they come up with, the ways that they then deliver this when they come back to the main room are always very, very eye-opening to me and astonishingly accurate and requiring very little, honestly, from me. So I facilitate the process. And certainly if there's something that isn't accurate, correct, or ask questions about and encourage them to think about. They can add their names in the student or in the comments at the bottom. They can add comments to each other in the comment section as well. So I try to utilize this in a way that encourages students to have to read, whether you read it before class or you're reading it during class, they now have to engage with the content directly. So just a couple of examples with Google, for instance. I also use Flipgrid, which is a great way to engage your students. In particular, if you don't require them to be on camera during the day in class, for instance. It's nice, though, for people to see each other, right? So my students actually really enjoy this. This is one that you can see many of them are actually smiling, which is unusual to me, right? So they create their little video in response to a prompt. Sometimes I attach an article or other things. This one was about Little Feet, Big World, about some imprints in the sand from many hundreds of years ago. So again, just connecting content in a way that could be scientific, it could be psychological. We do in my class, because I used to teach math, we also do math sometimes. And so we definitely are able to sort of create curriculum that bridges across not just one subject area, but truly is multidisciplinary. And so those are the primary examples that I would want to show you right now. I'm happy to answer other questions. I know we're probably at time at this particular moment for the main presentation, but I'm more than happy to stick around to answer other questions and to show other examples. I also very quickly, and I will include this in the email that Tom will send out to you, include the links because I couldn't figure out while I was chatting away on this screen to be able to grab the links that I wanted to share with you all. But this is another one for the 6E learning design that I think is really powerful. And it's not that you have to do all 6 E's necessarily, but it's nice to know about all of them and to think about ways in which you can include hopefully a little bit more engineering or application-based design into your instruction. So I appreciate the collegiality. I appreciate you guys are probably much more expert than I am, but I hope that I've spawned perhaps some conversations, some thoughts for you. And again, I'm happy to stick around and chat with anyone that wants to stick around for a few extra minutes. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.